turns out that learning from failure and learning from history in general is very difficult to do. There are these people called historians. They are very bad at teaching us how to learn from history, and they do it for a living. So we're very ambitious at an event like today to assume or presume that by sharing some stories that we can derive, no worries, so we can derive all these little nuggets and walk away and be smarter and wiser. And so this is something I've studied. I'm a writer. I write a lot of books. Some of those books involve trying to teach people stuff from history. And what I'm going to give you for the next 20 minutes is a distilled inoculation and protection that will help you filter through all the stories you hear today and all the stories you think about in your own life from your past, and how to do a much better job at filtering through all the biases that we're prone to about how we try and learn from failure. Okay. This is just a green glowing circle, so I don't know which direction it goes in. So if I go the wrong way, someone just yell at me, "You're going the wrong way." Okay. So my first story for you has to do with Achilles. Achilles, the mythological, legendary Greek warrior, fought in the Trojan Wars, many of the highlights. If you know the story, his mom dipped him as a child into the river Styx, which protected him and made him basically impervious to attack, except for where she held him, which was his ankle. Somehow in his long life and fighting many battles, his mother never told him, "Achilles, before you go out for battle today, wear an armored sock." Because what happened was he was attacked, he was hit by an arrow in his ankle, and that's what killed him. We have a legacy from Achilles in all of our bodies. It's called our Achilles tendon. It's the back part of your ankle. It does an amazing job for us quietly and silently. Every time you take a step, it carries 3 times your body's load, your body's weight of stress load. Because every time you step down, it has to carry all the pressure and all the work and all the body, all the energy that goes through your body to actually take a step forward. If you run or jump or do something more dramatic, like dance or run around at a launch party or something, it carries 7 times your body's weight. So I'd like all of you right now to do a little tactile exercise. Take your right hand, put it on your right leg, not your neighbor's leg, and go down. HR violations will be covered later. Go down and touch your Achilles tendon in the back of your ankle. And just play with it. Put your finger on it, move back and forth. It should be supple and move backwards, but it should feel like a bungee cord, really tense. So every time you take a step, it's doing all of this work for you without asking for payment or reward. And you have 2 of them that allow you to do all kinds of cool things in your life. It turns out that professional athletes, by the time they're in the middle or late careers, Achilles tendon injuries are somewhat common, and they're often devastating injuries. When an Achilles tendon injury happens, it basically means the Achilles tendon, this bungee cord, snaps, and it breaks, and it no longer functions. Now, how all this ties back to us in entrepreneurship and startups and trying to be successful learning from failure, this is a picture of David Beckham, who actually tore his Achilles tendon a few years ago. And as you can see in the picture, it's very painful. When failure happens, it's very painful. And the way our brains work, when failure happens, all of our focus goes to the point of failure. Where the pain is where your hands go. You go, oh, and your attention goes there, how do I stop the pain? So as an entrepreneur, when someone who's supposed to give you funding leaves the table, when one of your founders quits, when your best developer goes on a 5-day bender to Vegas and turns his cell phone off, when you have an acute moment of crisis, all of your attention goes to the crisis and how to stop the pain. And then usually what we do is we go back and look later and go, wow, what could we have done to avoid that? And then we move on. So all of this is, the first fallacy for you is the fallacy of single point of failure. This notion that there's one thing that happened and had it not happened, we would have been fine, so we're going to try to pretend like we're going to learn something by trying to figure out how to have made that thing not happen. Now related to Achilles tendons, so this is a picture of an Achilles tendon rupture. Actually it's not a picture, it's a diagram. If this was a picture, it'd be someone with more medical problems than just the Achilles tendon. And it shows the clear separation here. And I know so much about Achilles tendons because I actually tore my Achilles tendon like this 6 weeks ago. And like you guys, I'm a driven person. I care a lot about being successful at things. And through this entire process, I'm the kind of guy who asks the doctors lots of questions. Why did this happen? Why did it happen on that day and not the day before? Why did it happen next week? Why? I wanted all these answers. And I didn't like the answers that I got because they really weren't, they just wanted to know how to, they were going to try to figure out how to fix it. They didn't really have a theory as to what was going on and why. It was only later on when I went to see a physical therapist, the person who's in charge of trying to rehabilitate you and help you learn how to get through your failure and become successful again, to stretch the metaphor a little bit. And he explained to me, he said, Scott, you're worried about the wrong thing. Your Achilles tendon was probably fine. You didn't have some birth defect or some weird knockoff replacement brand Achilles tendon. Like, you had a normal, natural one that lasted you a long time. What was going on was you weren't thinking about the system that is your leg. And so he explained to me that as I've gotten older, my hips are no longer as flexible as they were. That my knee joint is no longer as flexible as it was either. My IT band, which all of you have as well, which runs along the outside of your leg, as you get older, it gets tighter and tighter. And so as all of these things declined in functionality, more and more stress was put on my Achilles tendon. Stress I couldn't see, stress I didn't know about. I didn't know what an IT band was, I didn't really know what a hip flexor was. But he explained to me that the whole story, if I really wanted to understand what had happened to my Achilles tendon, I had to look at the other pieces of the puzzle. Now what this means to you, this is a picture of me, evidence of me in recovery, just for fun. This is what I look like with my cast. This is what David Beckham looked like with his cast. The main distinction being he was cooler in every way, but I had a cooler cast. As was my claim to fame, the thing that I took pleasure in during that process. Now what does this mean for us? Well, this means that all the stories we know about failure, all the stories we tell, the things we're taught in school, the things that we think we're solid on because they happened a long time ago, we actually have very shallow, immature understandings of what happened. So this is a picture of the Challenger space shuttle disaster, 1986. How many of you are familiar with this? Good, you guys are still awake, excellent. Can anyone tell me what the high-level, superficial story was? What was the thing that didn't function that caused this? O-ring. 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 The O-ring. The Achilles. If only we had had a better O-ring, this would not have happened. That's the story that we're taught. So an O-ring, people really don't know what these things look like. O-rings are enormous. They're these large things supposed to cover the entire area of the rocket booster, prevent hot gas from going from one part to the other. And as the story that we were told went, the O-ring failed. It failed. That's the high-level Achilles tendon version of the story. O-ring failure. The O-ring had succeeded, nothing, it would have been great. There's this method for understanding failure and understanding how systems work called the 5 Whys, and it was invented by Toyota, the guy who started the company. And his basic premise is that the first layer that you understand is always going to be very superficial and pretty much useless, but it's probably going to be the most fun to say. You have to go and ask for the next layer down, the next why, the next why. And if you ask the first question, well, why did it fail? Or what happened that led to its failure? And you read up on some of the stuff. This is old history, so we should have this all figured out by now. This is the data recording mechanism that the engineers used to record after every launch event what had happened to the rocket boosters and the O-rings. This is what they used every time. And they were criticized for having such a crappy mechanism for recording data. People would joke about how ridiculous it would look like a box of crayons, that they were, this is supposed to be this important data scientific recording process, yet they had this lousy mechanism. And so Edward Tufte, how many of you are familiar with Edward Tufte? Edward Tufte is the man for whom any problem is just a chart waiting to happen. He will come to anyone's house, I'll fix your problem, make a chart. It's an amazing, almost psychopathic addiction to charts as solutions for things. But anyway, he came along and said the problem was they did not have a good enough chart. So he made a chart for them that looks like this, that showed as the temperature got colder, the O-rings worked worse and worse. He's like, well, if they just made a good chart, if they just read my books, they would have been fine. Now the fallacy here, which is a side fallacy, is that when the people made this chart, they were worried about hundreds of different kinds of failure. They were in the present moment, which all of us are in all the time when we're trying to make stuff happen. Tufte came along and knew the one thing that had gone wrong and made a chart that pointed it out. That's like going up to a barn and shooting a gun at it and then drawing the bullseye on it after. And go, oh look, it was perfect. It doesn't actually mean that Tufte or the approach Tufte's offering would have helped them at all in figuring out what had gone on. So the second why was about data. So first thing, O-ring, bad O-ring. Second thing, it was bad data. That's what Tufte's saying. If there was better data, we wouldn't have failed. But then there's a third one. Let's say you made an O-ring that was twice as good. Your infrastructure was twice as strong. You could handle twice as many hits on your server. You could still fail because there's someone who's always going to be behind that data to decide whether to launch the rocket or not. There's a third why. So all these stories that we know that are superficial, that only give us the point of failure, that's not enough to learn anything. The point of failure is almost never the cause, or it's unlikely to be the cause. It's likely not even the real weak link. The real weak link is the real weak link is going to be something that maybe have a tolerance that's high enough that it's not going to blow up or explode. It's going to be much more subtle indicators to let you know that stuff is causing the problem. So this leads us to the second fallacy that we have, the second fallacy. So the first one has to do with single point of failure. Second one has to do with simplicity and complexity. We have this problem with our brains. Our brains are not nearly as good as we think they are. Our brains are obsessed with narrative. Obsessed with narrative. The way our memories are structured, the way our prefrontal cortex works, we want things given to us in the format of this happened, this happened, this happened. Beginning, middle, and end. The universe is not necessarily constructed that way. So every time we interact with something in the world, we are filtering it based on the weird way our brain is constructed. What this means is, every time we hear a story, every time that we try to learn something, there may be a complicated version of the story of what happened that is true, but it's complicated, requires some effort to understand. On the other side, there's a simple lie. A simple story that really doesn't teach you anything, but it's fun to tell. Which one is going to be more popular? The simple lie. It's going to be easier to remember, it's going to be fun to tell, people are going to want to hear it, and it's going to become popular way faster than it was just a stupid O-ring. So you have to keep that in mind, that our brains are wired not to teach us the stuff we're trying to learn. We have to work against the natural cognitive biases we have about the kinds of stories that we hear. So for things like the space shuttle, the Titanic, Hindenburg, New Coke, all the stories that you know, that you think you understand why they failed, I guarantee you, you're wrong. If right now, while you're bored listening to me, you go up on the Wikipedia page for whatever it is story you think you know so well, it's one of these, oh, they were so stupid, New Coke is so bad. Go and read about it. Ask the second why. Well, why'd they do that? Why'd they do that? And all of a sudden you realize there's a complicated story that has way more value for you than just dismissing it as a simple, trivial stupidity thing that you would never have done if you were in the same situation. This is true for almost all the famous .com stories that we like to make fun of in the last 10 years, or even the last 5 years. Pets.com is the one where, as the legend goes, they would ship tons and pounds of dog food to people for free. Their business model was based on sending heavy goods to people for free. Not the whole story. There's a lot more to the story. I read a lot of postmortems, as many of you probably do. And there's a really good one that I read recently by Mark Hedlund, who was the CEO of Wasabi. And he had this to say about people's stories about failure. You'll hear a lot about why company A won or company B lost in any market. The theories thrown about, especially by the participants, are utter crap. And what I think he meant by this, I don't think he meant to be disparaging about the people involved. It just, if you're the center narrative of a story, your perspective is not the best. There's a lot that you didn't see. To really understand history, which is what you do when you look back at your failure, trying to understand your own history, you need more than one perspective. If you want to understand what went wrong in a company, yeah, of course you got to talk to the CEO. But the perspective that the lead engineer had is going to be very different. They're going to overlap, but they'll be different. The lead marketing person, very different. The junior intern, very different. A customer, very different. Taking those 4 or 5 different points of view and integrating them together is called journalism, or research, or history. There's a skill there to do that well. And it often requires a third party to do it, because the people involved have too much emotional stake involved to see things clearly. So before you assume that you have a clear view of the past, think about narrative bias and all these constructions that we have to identify, make it very difficult for us to do it as easily as we'd like. The third thing I want to talk about has to do with our egos. So all of us here have to admit to the fact that we have big egos. You want to start a company, you want to write a book, you think you can get up on a stage and teach people stuff. These are all things that demand having a lot of confidence that you have something to offer. Now, having a big ego having some ego is required. Because if you had no ego at all, you didn't think you could make anything, you didn't think of anything to say, you would watch TV all day, smoke pot all night. That's what you would do. We need people who believe they can do stuff, otherwise progress can't happen. So some amount of ego is essential. However, it's also problematic, because the same thing that makes us egotistical is the same thing that gets us into trouble. We think we are different. We think that rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to us. Sometimes we're right, often we're very wrong. If you think about just the sociology of what a hero is, what a heroic person does, which has metaphors to entrepreneurship and creation, they're crazy. If you're standing next to someone watching a building burn on fire and there's a kid on the 3rd floor and he goes running in there, the first thought in your mind is going to be, wow, that's a great guy. You're not fucking crazy. What is wrong with you? Every instinct in your body is about survival. You're going to run in there? Now, when he comes back out, we'll be the first to applaud and buy him dinner and congratulate him. But part of our brains are thinking, this guy's nuts. So all of you guys are nuts. In the best possible sense of the word. You guys are crazy. But we allow ourselves to be victimized by our own, our own hype. The way we talk about entrepreneurship, the literature, the books that we write, the way we sell them to each other. We make all these promises. We really believe that we won't fall victim to the data. Most companies fail. Most startups fail. Most books don't sell well. Most speakers suck. Like, we know this, right? But yet we're still willing to do it anyway. So we have to keep a really careful balance and watch over how our egos fuel us without letting them blind us. That's a very difficult thing to do. I'm not sure how to do it. I'm not even sure that I'm capable of doing it. But it helps at least to recognize that we create our own blind spots simply by the passion that we have for trying to create stuff. So my last point for you has to do with our bad perceptions. There's this saying, it's a very important saying, that we tend to fight the last war. We tend to fight the last war. When we look back and we study about what happened, we have so many emotions around it that we bring baggage from that into the present. And it's offered as if there's some way to avoid it. I'm pretty sure that we can't, and I'm going to explain to you why. There's another saying about warfare that's germane to entrepreneurship, which is called the fog of war. It comes from a Prussian military philosopher in the 18th century or 19th century. And he had this to say. He said, 3/4 of the things in which all action war is based on are lying in a fog of uncertainty. And what he means is, as a trained general with a lot of experience fighting a lot of battles and well-trained troops, when you're in the battle, you really have no idea what's going on. You have no idea. There's too much data being thrown at you at the same time to effectively parse it in real time. It's the fog of war. And that means that we are prone to projecting our experiences onto the present. And sometimes they're accurate, but often they're not. Now, my favorite way to explain this is in terms of 80s driving video games. So, in the present, when you're in your startup, you're in your company, you're doing your thing right now, the thing you're working on right now, it's like pole position. You're in first person. All the data is right in front of you. It's present right there. You can't see the horizon. It's way back there where you kind of want to go, but it's too far to be useful to you. Your attention is so focused on the present, your peripheral vision is really bad. And because the turns come so quickly, because you're driving really fast, you're thinking a lot about what happened the last time you raced, and you're trying to use that to predict what's going to happen next. You're using the data from your experience to project it into your future, and that's how you're going to try to anticipate what happens next. That's what life is like. A lot of bad data, you're going too fast, and you're trying to use what you've learned to help you in the present. And then later on, after your startup has failed or has been successful, you've IPO'd, whatever the goal was or whatever the outcome was, we look backwards. And we think now with a much greater perspective. Because we're in the third person now, like, oh, look at what happened. So this is like Super Sprint. Ariel, you're looking down now. We go, oh, I should have turned left when I turned right. Oh, I didn't see that thing coming. This is definitely a much better view of our own experience. However, there's a fallacy in it that we don't talk about very often. And that fallacy is that we think this view is perfect. We think we have a perfect view. And we think also that this view is the only way history could have unfolded. How many of you believe in free will? Were you free to raise your hand? Ha 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 ha. If you believe in free will in the present, that means that you have to believe in free will in your past. So when you look backwards, what we tend to do is go, oh, well, this happened, and that happened. Therefore, if I had done this, oh, I now see what I should have done. But in reality, if we had free will in the past, and our competitors and our coworkers and the marketplace, they all had free will, then the actual outcome may have been a very low probability of what could have happened in that time. If you look back at the past and you only look at exactly what happened and you act like it was preordained, you may be getting a very skewed view of what the reality was. When you look back at your own past, you have to ask questions like, well, what would have happened if there were more competitors? Or less? That could have been a very real possibility. Or what if one of them made a slightly different decision that was a critical decision to the outcome? You may have done everything right in your history, but based on the decisions of the other players, the outcome was bad. A huge number of the factors that determine the outcome are not in your control. Yet when we look backwards, we tend to think the opposite. We think it was all in our control, and only if we had done this a little differently, or just done this first, or done this last, the outcome would have been different. And that's a huge fallacy. We like to make fun of the people who look at history and ask these questions of history. The people who go, what would have happened if Germany had won World War II? Or what would happen if nuclear missiles were invented in 1825? There are these people who write these books, and we look at them as crackpots. We think of them as like conspiracy theorists, that somehow why would you spend any time entertaining that history could have unfolded any differently? We pretend that we believe in destiny, which is, am I being cut off? Destiny. Yes, it did.
Sorry, you're actually out of time.
I was expecting the hook to come. I'm almost done. All right, there we go. Thank you. We assume that when we look backwards that it was destiny. It was the only way things could have unfolded. When we believe in free will in the present, it has to be a fallacy. So when you look backward, part of the exercise you have to do is ask the question, what are the reasonable things that could have gone differently that I did not control? What can I learn from that? What can I learn from those possible outcomes? We have so much emotional pain in looking backwards, we kind of want to do it as like a brief first date where we jump in and escape as quickly as we can. But there's way more data to be mined in our own past if we're willing to recognize these fallacies that we have. So to wrap up, there's this famous quote by George Santayana. He said, "Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And he's not quite right. If you're learning the wrong things from history, you can learn from history as much as you want, but you're learning the wrong lessons. You're blind to these fallacies. But if you keep these fallacies in mind as you're trying to learn from experience and learn from failure, and learn from other people's story of failure, that improves the odds you're actually going to get value out of the exercise that you're going through trying to learn from what has happened to you. So that's my story, those are my photo credits, and thank you for listening.